We planned this meeting some months ago, and of course that was before the recent events in Hong Kong began to unfold. And clearly I'm not going to speak very much about Hong Kong, but what I will do is flag up some things about the Hong Kong protests that seem to me to relate to what I am going to say about the sustainability of the Chinese developmental model, the growth and rise of Chinese economic and political power. Because these are extreme, not only are they inspiring events from the point of view of millions, a quarter of the population of Hong Kong at various times being on demonstrations against the local authorities there, but they've got a wider significance. They firstly indicate a problem that the Chinese, not just the Hong Kong, but the Chinese ruling class faces over the legitimacy of its system. They also indicate the capacity of people, young people in particular, but not only young people, to resist what seem on the surface to be authoritarian states that are impregnable almost. They also demonstrate, just as the Arab Spring did, the enormous imagination of people in evading the security forces. So, for instance, the use of encrypted apps so that people can talk to each other and get to the right place for the demonstration, as well as, when going to the demonstrations, not using Oyster cards so they can't be tracked and so on. There's an elementary form of basic organisation, of solidaristic organisation. But the main reason, I think, from the point of view of the sustainability of the Chinese model, is that in the long term, and we're seeing it all over the world with the rise of authoritarian regimes in Brazil, Modi in India, Salvini leading the show in Italy, Putin, Trump, and so on. The long-term problems that the capitalist system is facing, and which rulers know about, even if they don't tell us, means that the space for progressive and democratic reforms is closing. It's never been very large, but it's closing at the moment. And therefore, these sorts of protests in Hong Kong are vital to keep our movement moving and inspiring other people around the world. But I'm not going to say very much more about Hong Kong, if anything. What I'm going to do in the meeting is try to justify my claim that the space for progressive reforms is diminished. And remains small for the future. And that poses questions about the sustainability of the Chinese model. I'm also not going to say very much, by the way. I don't know if anybody's here thinking that the word sustainable in the title refers to environmental sustainability. If so, I apologise. You should be at Martin Empson's meeting somewhere or other nearby on the ecology. But I will say something about that. But my main focus is on the contradictions of the political economy of China's current model and the problems that its ruling class faces. Okay, let's say something about China's rise. It's been written about ad nauseam, not including by me. I mean, I suppose I'm a bit childish in some ways. Some of the scale of China's rise and some of its technological advances are really quite striking in a very short space of time. And I'll just give you a flavour of this. In 1978, when the openness began under Deng Xiaoping, after Mao's death, when China began a process, initially for the first 10 years quite limited, opening up to the world system, it really kicked off in the early 1990s. But in 1978, China's exports were $10 billion a year. You know, we can remember, those of us old enough, what did you buy from China? Very little. You know, that balm for your muscles or boxes of tea and stuff like that. Very little. By the last figures from the World Bank, 2017, China's exports were 2,263 billion. Whatever that is, 226 times as many in a generation, effectively. Another indication. Huge investment in infrastructure. A decade ago, China had no bullet trains and no track on which bullet trains could go. Now it's got the world's biggest bullet train network, bigger than all the rest of them. Same with motorways. In a decade, China has built, in one province, as much mileage of motorways as the entire British network, and so on and so forth. The rise is real. There's I'm sorry, I didn't mean this, I hadn't written it down as a pun. These are concrete developments, motorways and so on. World capitalism would be in a much less healthy place today after the 28 crisis than it is were it not for China's model. Drawing in, figures vary somewhere between $250 and $500 million underproductive, low surplus producing peasants from the countryside, turning them into proletarians in the city, pumping out surplus value not just for the Chinese ruling class and Chinese private capitalists, but for the system as a whole. China's rise is predicted to continue, I'll come on to that, in the minds at least of the rulers, with its Made in China 2025 project, which seeks to place China in the vanguard in a range of the next technologies. The quantum internet, somebody might tell me what that is in the question part. The quantum internet, robotics, various forms of high technology, the space race, and so on. So, China's rise is real. We'll get that out of the way. That was quick. The environmental aspects of it, however, pose questions about its sustainability from an environmental point of view. Again, very little to be said on this because it's not my main focus. China's the biggest polluter in the world in absolute terms, and it has been growing by 10% a year since about the early part of the 21st century. The rate of growth has slowed off, but there's still a problem. Authoritarian regimes can be quite good at solving problems in the short term. Thus, you will not do that, you will do that, and that means there has been a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in some years. But the moment that, and this is ironic, climate change meant in 2016 that rains fell less on the Himalayas. Therefore, the rivers of China were not as full. Therefore, the hydroelectric power plants, the Three Gorges Gap Dam in particular, weren't producing sufficient electricity. And in that year, greenhouse gas emissions rose by 3%, most of it, according to one estimate, accounted for by extra burning of Chinese coal in their power stations to make up for the absence of hydroelectric power. There are other serious problems of an ecological nature. Only 1% of China's urban population breathe air considered safe by European Union standards. Water, it's going to be a big problem. China's got 20% of the world's population, 6% of the world's fresh water. Because there's not enough of it to dilute pollution, much of that is polluted. 85% of drinking water in some of the big cities is not drinkable, so I shouldn't call it drinking water therefore, is not drinkable, it's not fit for human consumption. It's not safe. The ruling class are aware of this, which is why so many of them, the majority, import food for themselves and their families. They won't eat locally produced Chinese food. Can this get better anytime soon? Renewables are on the upturn, hydroelectric being one of them, solar panels and so on. But China remains a fossil fuel economy. 2/3 of its energy comes from coal. I had to check this figure from 3 different sources. I saw it in a textbook. China's coal mining, at the last figure, which was last year I think it was 3.5 billion tonnes of coal. Now, Britain was a big coal producer. Its highest point was 1913. It produced 280 million tonnes of coal. China's coal production is 12 or 13 times Britain's was at its height, and 2/3 of its energy is predicted to continue to come from coal. The same is true of oil. China produces some oil, quite a lot of oil actually, and it burns it all. So China's going to have ongoing environmental problems, and despite its green rhetoric, which it used against Trump after America pulled out of the climate accord, despite its green rhetoric, it will be a major polluter. So that's the environmental aspect. No more about that. I want to focus now on the political economy aspects of China's model. Excuse me. And there are a series of very significant problems, either current or on the horizon. All the people who write about China from a Marxist point of view, this one's Ho Fung Hung, Minky Lee's another one, they all saying exactly the same thing. There's nothing new here, I'm just bringing it together. There is a significant problem, firstly, of debt. China rescued both its own model and the global system in 2008 with a vast infusion of money into the system. The state banks were encouraged to turn the taps on to lend to private corporations and state-owned enterprises to keep the economy ticking over. The consequence of that is that China's corporate sector is the most indebted in the world, 160% of GDP. The corporate debt represents 160% of gross domestic product. In the financial sector, estimates vary, but up to 450% of GDP is constituted by debt in the financial sector. So that a well-known Chinese analyst of these things, Charlene Chu, estimates that of that, because of the way that state banks turn the taps on, something like a third of it may be bad debt, to be written off if possible, but with the threat of contagion, like the subprime crisis 10 years ago or more, contagion for the rest of the system, both locally and globally. There are very few Marxists writing about financial matters in the City of London, just over there. One of them's a guy from Oxford called George Magnus. Nothing more about George Magnus, it's not relevant, but anyway, he argues that the debt crisis in China makes it, quote, a classic risk for a fall, just like America and then the domino effect a decade or so ago. There's lots more aspects of debt that we could explore in the questions. I mean, in some cities, the property price boom makes London housing look cheap, considerably cheap. Okay? That's the first thing then, a big problem of debt overhang. Secondly is corruption, and the two go together. What Ho Fung Hung talks about here is the way, contrary to most people's belief, although there's a political centre, Beijing, an authoritarian one, there's a considerable decentralisation of the system, where local party elites are competing with each other for scarce resources to develop their own area. So you get, therefore, contributing to the debt, white elephant projects, infrastructure development that are replicated all over the system but not joined together. So there's an enormous overaccumulation, which I'll come on to. How they've achieved that at the local level is to create arm's length private subsidiaries of local government who do the construction or do the borrowing and are embroiled deeply in corruption. One instance of that, one mechanism, is that they drive people off land, use political power to appropriate public land and then sell it to their developer friends. Now, corruption has become such a big problem that one of the characteristics of Xi Jinping's rule is a corruption clampdown because of the problem of legitimacy for the system as a whole. The recognition that without a clampdown on Communist Party members embroiled in corruption, there is a problem of legitimacy. And the numbers are staggering. I won't go through the lot, but just one. 10% of Central Committee members, as well as senior military figures and state-owned enterprises members and so on, chief executives, 10% of Central Committee members have been done for corruption, gone through the courts and so on. So this is a ginormous problem for the ruling class. That's also interesting, but again, no more on that. The crucial thing, it seems to me, in terms of the long-term sustainability of the model, is the overaccumulation of capital. It's classic, from a Marxist point of view, it's utterly simple to analyse. Labour produces surplus value and produces profit. Capital is dead labour. It doesn't produce anything unless it's combined with living labour. In China's case, 50% of national income, on average, over the last 15 or 20 years, has been accumulated. An enormous overaccumulation in historical and global comparisons. The average for the rich countries, the OECD, the G7 and so on, is about 20%. 20% of national income goes to investment. In China, 50%. Disproportionately, therefore, labour is squeezed. The very thing that produces the profits is a smaller proportion of the economy in China than it is elsewhere. One consequence of that is that what Marx called the organic composition of capital, the proportion of dead labour to living labour, the organic composition goes up, the profit rate goes down. And that, paradoxically, is not something that they can do very much about because, paradoxically, they're still so far behind their major competitors. Just to give you a flavour, in 2015, there were 10 industrial robots per 10,000 workers in China. The figures will have gone up quite markedly because of the Made in China programme. But 10 industrial robots per 10,000 workers in China, 100 in America, 300 in Germany and Japan, and over 500 in South Korea. Way behind in productivity terms. Secondly, China's capital stock per worker is a quarter of South Korea's and a fifth of America's. As a consequence, the value added per Chinese worker annually is $20,000, but it's $110,000 in America and $80,000 in the EU. So China is over-accumulating, but still a long way behind, and therefore seems to have to continue to over-accumulate capital to make up the productivity gap. What flows from over-accumulation? First thing I've mentioned is declining rate of profit. The figures are not clear. It's not easy to get accurate figures, but it's estimated that for the economy as a whole, the profit rate is in single figures. The public sector, more like 1 or 2%, the private sector approaching 10%. Okay? But it's a low rate of profit. One consequence of that, and I think the Chinese capitalist class has got wind of the problem, recognises the problem. They have been involved for some years, albeit it's been clamped down on to some degree, in capital flight, getting money out quick. So, for instance, in 2016, $28 billion left China every month, often through Macau or Hong Kong. 28 billion a month. Compare that to the EU's firms' investments in China, 8 billion a year. You get the sense of the scale. 28 billion a month leaving, the EU investing 8 billion a year. A colossal contrast. One other thing flows, and this would be a separate meeting and separate subject entirely. One other thing flows from the overaccumulation is the Belt and Road Initiative. Xi Jinping's project, there's a bit of debate about whether it's a project. Thanks, not too bad. How much it's an integrated project, but the crucial thing is it's about the export of capital to relieve the pressure on the Chinese economy of low profit rates. We could say more about the Trump effect. Let's just show you that graph from The Economist 2 or 3 weeks ago. The Trump effect is having an effect on China. That's imports into China. The dark line is from the United States, but generally from the rest of the world. China's imports falling dramatically under the pressure. This is another problem for the Chinese ruling class. The high-tech thing there, we aren't using Chinese technology. If we were, we would have that behind me. Okay, so there's a lot of problems. They all add up to a set of internal and external problems for the Chinese ruling class. What I want to now do is focus on two things to finish. Firstly, the working class. The most important thing for people in this meeting, we're most interested in what's happening with the working class. What is the resistance to this? What's the prospects for social change and progressive reform or even revolution? Firstly, then, let me quote Minky Lee. I haven't brought the book. Very important writer, American-based Chinese writer. Under the current trend, in a few years, a militant Chinese working class movement will emerge, he wrote in 2016. The spectre of a working class revolution is resurfacing in China in the 21st century. He's making a general statement that capitalism's grave digger is the working class. There's a bit of wishful thinking in there, a bit of hope. As you'll see, it's not a simple trajectory. The more workers there are, the bigger the threat to capitalism. But it's clear that we've gone from a situation when 500 million or thereabouts new workers rescued capitalism to a situation where those workers are now much more established in cities, and there's a growing sense of class consciousness. And we've seen that in a strike wave effectively from 2007 to 2014 on a colossal scale. Again, Minky Lee started with crane drivers in Shenzhen. I remember Lawrence mentioning this many years ago about the crane drivers' strikes and how important they were. They won pay rises, they won compensation for unpaid overtime, a whole host of other things. The strike in Shenzhen then spread to automobiles, textiles, and all sorts of high-tech sectors. And again, wave after wave of strikes, most of them lasting 1 or 2 days, won pay rises, doubling the minimum wage in many cities, and a host of other benefits, including, in 2010, new labour regulations offering effectively ACAS, sort of conciliation, national bargaining, local bargaining, collective bargaining rules, and so on. The state had to respond. Some of the strikes lasted 3 or 4 weeks, showing a level of organisation and combativity that scared the ruling class into making these concessions. But when they made the concessions, the class was emboldened and went further. So what we then saw, and why we need to be a bit careful about simply saying the ruling class is on its, is shaky and the working class is on the up, is that under Xi Jinping they clamped down. And we've seen since 2015, what had emerged was a group of Marxist students, the revitalising of Maoist networks, labour NGOs, and when I say NGOs I don't mean Oxfam, I mean young Marxist students linking with workers, going to picket lines. Some of them took an industrial turn in the language of Trotskyism. They gave up their university posts and went into factories in order to organise unofficial, not state-led unions, rank and file unions, some of them where they could work with the official trade union, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, work with local committees because they were subject to the pressure from below, and consequently there was a movement around there. So a host of things had developed in the strike wave, and when in 2015 the regime moved against the new networks. It did it with feminists, radical lawyers protecting civil society members from crooked local governments and so on. So we'd got, on the one hand, a growing class consciousness, and then a reaction to that from the state. You won't see this in detail, but I can prove to you that if that's the picture of strikes from the China Labour Bulletin in 2014, lots of strikes everywhere. By 2017, although there's some deviation around Beijing, they went up, mainly they came down in dramatic numbers. As Cliff used to say, class consciousness is one thing, class confidence is another. And 2015 onwards, the confidence was knocked out of the movement. That is part and parcel of a deepening authoritarianism in the Chinese Communist Party that seems to me to reflect the idea that things are not going to go very well for China's rulers in the next decade. They're preparing themselves for greater clashes, to corral workers and civil society for the crisis that is likely to come from in the next little while. I'll end with a conclusion, which is a good thing to end with, I suppose. I'll end with this, because what what I've just said about the clampdown since 2015, it's not terribly optimistic. And I think it's fair to say that Marxists, given their numbers in the world, have to have some degree of optimism to keep going. Gramsci used to say, pessimism of the intellect, you look around and think the world's not terribly wonderful, but optimism of the will, things can happen. Well, I think there's something that should make us a little optimistic. Minky Lee's book, China and the 21st Crisis, one of its last chapters is called The Unsustainability of Chinese Capitalism. And in there, he makes an argument, which I think is very valid. After the 1970s, when the world crisis impacted everywhere, which is why it was a world crisis, rising trade union demands, general strikes all over the place, profitability crisis, and so on. China saved the global system by offering what the Marxist geographer David Harvey calls a spatial fix. It opened up a new space for capital accumulation, a space where there were 500 million new workers who could produce surplus for the system. What Minky Lee says is that space no longer exists. The next crisis is not going to have that available to it. Often people say India's touted as the possibility. If you look at India, there's a number of things which mean this is unlikely to happen. Firstly, literacy rates. One of the advantages of state capitalism, authoritarian state capitalism on the Chinese model, it had a revolution. It had to live by the revolution. It wasn't a socialist revolution, but it was a national developmental revolution. And as a consequence of that, literacy, a sense of some sort of empowerment was vital. So the Chinese working class was available as a literate, reasonably well-skilled class in 1978 when the opening started. That is not anywhere near the same case in India today. Leaving aside the fact that India's got democracy and a vibrant civil society as a consequence, we can question how democratic it is. But nevertheless, there's the toing and froing of parties, and consequently the authoritarianism is somewhat weaker. So China was able to deliver up to the world system a docile but literate and skilled working class. The spatial fix is not available to the system as a whole today. Additionally, going back to China, away from India, China's population is working age population is already in decline and is predicted to decline by 5 million a year henceforth. So the numbers of workers generating surplus is problematic. So there's nowhere that's likely to be able to provide this spatial fix. So where does this leave us? Both for the system as a whole, but specifically for China. Well, I'm going to paraphrase it right at this last moment, the argument of Minky Lee. I think it's an important one. He says, theoretically, Chinese capitalism could rebalance itself away from overaccumulation and reduce the rate of accumulation. First point. Theoretically, it could. However, this would leave China behind the very countries it's competing with. I mentioned about the number of robots and all that sort of thing. So it's not an option that the Chinese ruling class wants to pursue because it would lock it into its relatively peripheral and dependent position in the world. Okay. Also, the system wouldn't want this because actually China's accumulation allows it to produce for the world capitalist market and keeps wages down everywhere else. T-shirts, Marxism T-shirts are the highest paid labour, they're paid properly for. But your H&M, was it? H&M and Primark. T-shirts made by Chinese and Bangladeshi labour, they get paid €1 for 18 T-shirts. That means that we can all buy cheap clothes and not make major demands for wages. And we've lived for 10 years with flat wages without getting too aerated about it. So China delivers for the world system to some degree. So to stop accumulation limits that capacity. It also limits the competitiveness of Chinese capitalism. That would be undermined vis-a-vis its neighbours, its rivals. Also, if you're not accumulating on a massive scale, for the economy to continue to grow, and that's the deal with the Chinese population, you'd have to shift to some of the growth area, and that would be wages, domestic consumption. That in turn would weaken the profit rate further. Wages go up, capital accumulation goes down, relatively speaking. So China's caught on the horns of a dilemma, and this seems to me to explain Xi Jinping's authoritarian turn in the long term, because this is not resolvable under capitalism unless under very draconian conditions. Now, I'm not claiming that China's economy is about to implode. It's got enormous resilience and strength. It is producing colossal outputs of the sort that I mentioned. But certain Chinese scholars, and I've got the name down here, it's not terribly important who specifically is saying these things. There's a whole load of people saying time is running out. The debt crisis, in particular, is a bubble waiting to burst. That will then have a dramatic knock-on effect on the rest of us. And it also means that the resources available to the Chinese state that it's thrown at the problem of the contradictions of the Chinese economy increasingly are not available to it. If that begins to happen, and as growth rates continue to fall, and they've gone from 10% annually to about 6%. One Chinese economist says it's all about double counting. They're really only 3 now anyway. I can't comment on that, but it seems to me, I'm not a mathematician, I can't tell whether that's true, but it has been said. At this point, if growth stops or slows dramatically, or indeed reverses, then the unwritten contract between the Chinese ruling class and its society, that we will make you richer, we will give you opportunities in life that your parents and grandparents didn't have, we will develop China and restore it to its rightful place in the world system, but you lot won't demand democracy and rights and you'll keep your heads down, that unwritten contract will be torn up. And therefore, the sorts of protests that we're seeing in Hong Kong will just be a precursor to the sorts of struggles that we will need to open up a space for progress and democracy, whilst facing this enormous pressure not to enhance democracy and workers' rights and so on. It's not just hopeful Marxists in the West saying this. The Prime Minister of China, Wen Jiabao, in 2007 warned at a Central Committee meeting, I think it was, or a party congress, the model is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unstable. Very little has changed since then, since 2007. I missed the word unsustainable off. I said unstable twice. It's unsustainable, okay? There's very little that's changed. It remains export dependent. There's still weak consumption. There's enormous over-accumulation, enormous debt. Therefore, in that context, if we think globally, think of the pressures on capitalism, think about the movements that we've seen in Hong Kong, the Arab Spring and elsewhere. Although it might not seem to be the case now, given the repression that's happening in China, and I could say much more about the repression, and perhaps I will in the summing up, it may not appear to be the case at the moment, but we should be optimistic that, to paraphrase Lenin, when he was writing about the 20th century, he said it's a century of wars and revolutions. It seems to me no different. The 21st century will be a century of wars and revolutions, and at the centre of it will be the Chinese working class. Thanks.